team. Welcome back to Game Time. I'm your host and coaching teammate, Shauna Griffiths. Today, we are back with another conversation with an impactful leader who I am absolutely honored to have on the show today. I've been a fan, a little bit of a stalker on LinkedIn, I have to say. Martin Gutmann is joining us. Thank you so much for joining today. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm very excited. Let's do this.
So, folks, Martin is a courageous leader himself, a writer, a speaker, an author of a book. You can, if you're watching the video, you can see it in the upper corner of his screen, The Unseen Leader. What I see you doing, Martin, is drawing parallels with history, helping to us to see that and then draw links to better understand and impact the way we move forward. And you also have a part about this leadership and technology that I really want to make sure that we dig into, because you've got so much of this coming at us so fast. You're Switzerland based, is that correct?
Yeah, I work in Switzerland. I live in southern Germany, though, right across the border. That's a bit unimaginable for most American listeners. In Europe, that's pretty normal. I guess it's like working in Minnesota and living in Wisconsin, something like that.
Well, thank you so much for making it work on timing and everything. This has been in the works for a while. I've been just so excited and honored to have you on. And to help our audience understand you and what you're here to speak about, can you give us, ground us in a bit of your background and how did you come to the place you are today, making this your life's work?
Sure, and thank you for those very kind words. You described me as a leader, which is not how I would describe myself. I'm more of a a scholar of leadership, or an observer of leadership. And in my own life, I actually have a tremendous amount of respect for people who do carry a lot of responsibility for big teams, for complex organizations. But to be fair, that's not something that I have done myself. Now, with that said, I don't know that that's necessarily something that can stand in your way from understanding something. And sometimes that can actually be to your benefit, that you have a little bit of distance, a little bit more neutrality vis-a-vis the thing you're studying. So yeah, I mean, there's many different people out there who write and speak about leadership. It's one of those hot topics right now, for good reason. I think we need good leaders due to a very uncertain and very crisis-ridden world today. In most business schools, so I teach at a business school in Switzerland, most business schools, the people who teach leadership have a psychology background. And I think that's one good lens to bring onto questions of leadership. What is kind of the makeup of these people? What's the internal process that people might undergo, or how they've developed in order to be able to influence people? I am a historian by training, not a psychologist. And that just gives me, a different set of tools, a different set of perspectives on the same phenomenon of leadership. I think this question really of how can an individual shape the outcome of events? How can an individual shape the group of people with whom they are working? So that's the story. That's the story of me and what I'm interested in a nutshell.
It's so interesting because a lot of times when I'm talking about leadership like this, and why I said to you, I look at you as a leader because it's the way you're choosing to show up in this world. And so the way you're showing up for yourself every day, the way you're showing up for all of us who are tuning in, listening, learning, to me, talk about a large, call it organization. It's not an organization, but it is just like humanity, right? And I think that it does take courageous people who are willing to do those things so that people who are in seats of, call it complex organizations or even a simple organization, it kind of doesn't matter. It's still, what are the choices you're making every
Yeah.
day to lead yourself? And if you can do that, then that's fundamentals, foundational for then you can lead others overtly, but also people can just look. I was saying to you earlier, it's about possibility. People can look at you and think, oh, that shows me a way of showing up. Or they can hear you talk about these examples in history that we have an opportunity, right, to choose to learn from and say, oh, that's leadership as well. So that's a little bit of context. So I'm declaring you are very much a leader. And I really appreciate all you're doing, because part of it is I'm curious if you had any backlash, because a lot of times what can happen is when we become really vocal about better leadership and ways, it can feel threatening to some folks who, and when I mean backlash, it's not necessarily like attack, but sometimes we get shunned, or you'll see people on LinkedIn who are like, I don't want to post on LinkedIn my opinion because they're worried about backlash.
Yeah.
So any thoughts there?
It's a great question. I'm excited to answer it. Well, I think first of all, as we all know, social media is a bit of a bubble. So the people who tend to engage with my content and the people with whom I tend to engage are relatively aligned, let's say. So, and I think that's one of the dangerous and very unfortunate circumstances of the, let's say, online global community that we find ourselves in. But that means that I actually don't get that much backlash, certainly not on LinkedIn or over such channels. What I should say is I don't read the public comments on YouTube. So I had a TED Talk last year that's been viewed quite a few times. I think there's well over 1,000 comments on there. I have not read any of them. And even though I imagine some of them to be positive and friendly and supportive, even if there's just one that's not, that would be a bit, it's hard. It's hard to hear. It's important to be open to feedback, but I think the way feedback is often given in the comments section is not very productive. And I don't know that I want to read what people have to say about my talk in there. So
great example, I think, as you discussed, that is for those of us who are working to use our voices to do work in this leadership space, either in the big picture or for ourselves, to be more effective for ourselves, for the people in our care in the business. There is again a choice to how much do we entertain those comments from, it's like everybody in the stands. I use a lot of sports analogies. You're always going to have people booing in the stands, right? And so there's a degree to which it is a delicate balance of being open to feedback, but then also some degree you have to consider the source. It's a great thing to surface though, because again, I believe that a sign of an effective leader or a leader who's on the journey of becoming who we're meant to be is having those check-ins with themselves.
Yeah.
And is able to decide, what do I need to pay attention to or not? Because otherwise you're just opening up this vortex of negativity.
Yep. Agreed. No, and I think that's where, as you say, we need some form of feedback, and we need some mechanisms that help us reflect on ourselves and the impact, positive or negative or neutral, of the actions that we're taking. But we have to be deliberate about, what feedback channels we're soliciting. There's a lot to it, because the other layer I was going to say is I know of some leaders who solicit a lot of feedback from their teams. However, there's not enough trust there. So the feedback they get is just going to be affirming that, oh, you're doing a great job, keep doing it. Mm-hmm. But behind the scenes, people are more concerned. So that's the other point around feedback, that I think without trust, without kind of a safe environment, feedback doesn't really serve its purpose either.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely, especially if you ask for feedback and then you do nothing about the feedback. So that's another extension of it. And in your study of leadership rooted in your background in history. Talk, talk to us about what compelled that.
Well, as I said, I work in a business school, and I've actually taught in management faculties or business schools my entire academic career. And one of the things I realized very early on in that process was that within, especially kind of popular leadership studies, kind of the blogs and a lot of these best-selling books on leadership, historical examples are really prominent. People love to kind of imagine what Napoleon did or would have done, and JFK, and these very prominent heroic leadership types. And what I realized as I started, working within this leadership and management ecosystem was that a lot of the historical examples that were being used, or often specifically how they were being used, how people wrote about Churchill or JFK or Napoleon, didn't really correspond to what I had learned as a historian. It didn't line up with how professional historians described Churchill's role in the Second World War, etc. And so I just became curious about this, as I framed this question, why are we celebrating the wrong leaders? Why are we picking out these people who professional historians do not necessarily single out as having been the most influential or having had the most positive impact on events? So that's where this started. And interestingly, I approached this through my historical lens. So I looked at periods of kind of great turbulence, and then asked myself, among the professional historians who study this period, who do they single out? And I chose to profile 4 leaders in 4 such turbulent times. And one of them is also Churchill, who, of course, has been celebrated by many people as one of the great leaders of the 20th century. And there, my argument is, he was truly the architect of the Allied victory in the Second World War, but not for the reasons that these more popular accounts attribute it to, right? So there's often this sense in, let's say, the popular leadership studies that Churchill's speeches, really just led his nation to fight to the bitter end and stand up to this Nazi tyranny. And along with his speeches, his rhetoric, his beautiful, way of using his voice, the other thing that was kind of his secret sauce was his constant hounding of his generals to kind of get on the offensive, to get things done. Like, let's get moving no matter what. That doesn't correspond at all to what professional historians say. Right? First of all, if rhetoric and great speeches could win wars, then Hitler and Mussolini would have won, because they were pretty good at that too. Right? And many of these early offensives where Churchill hounded his generals to get moving, they were actually, ended in mishaps and was kind of a waste of resources. So that's not an example of good leadership. He was able to win the war despite this, his inability to be patient, let's say. What really won the war was his ability to build an international coalition the way the world had never seen before. This was a lot of behind-the-scenes work to get the U.S. on board and later to get the Soviet Union supplied. And that's very boring. The way to understand this is to read all the telegrams and to look at the subtle changes in policy behind the scenes. You can't write a best-selling book about this. You can't make a best-selling movie about that, but that's what he did. And that's kind of my finding overall, is that very often the truly influential actions, right, that really have an impact are not so dramatic and spectacular. They're not bestseller material, right? It's often very subtle, very long-term, very behind the scenes. And I think that's true in a lot of organizations today as well, right? The leaders who really get what is driving their current challenges, who build processes or culture that kind of aligns with that, that doesn't look very dramatic, right? And it usually doesn't require them to then have these, loud and kind of dramatic pep talks in front of everybody, right? It's more subtle, but it's effective.
Gosh, as you were saying it, I was having so many flashes of examples in in business of that. And I think it's part of what compelled me so much to be more vocal about leadership, to start this podcast, was I was seeing so many people in corporate America on the mic, in being featured in publications, being talked about, to your point. So I don't even know if it's impactful, but it's just being, again, celebrated, right? And I was looking at it going, right, but they're not doing those things. They're not doing the internal work to then be able to lead themselves and then lead other
Yeah.
people effectively.
Yeah.
And I quite frankly got sick of it. And so my thought was, what can I do to be showcasing this, sort of unveiling the truth of how you can operate as a leader and not have it be what I often call the me show. So some of those leaders that come in and they're all about themselves and talking so loud with that dramatic thing. To me, it's like, it's honestly, I call it distractify. It's like this Operation Distractify, which I will say, like, point blank, this is what's happening in America in government. It's terrifying. And this is part of why I'm so excited to have you here and helping us to see a bit through that, or to at least, and you talk about this, I love it, is like this reframing of things. How can we shift that and see what's going on? And partly that so that we can lead ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of reframing leadership is maybe to get away from celebrating leaders at all. I mean, I started with this question, why are we celebrating the wrong leaders? But I would suggest we shouldn't celebrate any leaders per se. I mean, take Churchill. He, like I said, he's, there's not a single architect of the Allied victory in the war. But if we had to pick out one person who was most influential, it's him. With that said, he spent a lot of his career before the war making the lives of many people, especially in the global south, in India, in Africa, miserable. Right? So I don't think we should be celebrating the guy. However, we can learn a lot about effective leadership from him, especially during this World War II episode. And I think that kind of thinking is necessary today as well, in the smallest teams to the biggest organizations and countries, that the person who kind of holds the biggest levers, they have a lot more responsibility, and sure, they can very often have more influence than somebody far lower down in the hierarchy. But to suggest that it's their actions and their decisions alone that ensure a positive outcome, I think is false. Right? There's a lot more work, a lot more people, and a lot more, let's say, context that goes into shaping a successful organizational outcome, or if we're talking about a country or whatever the case might be.
Yeah. It's so, I think, I don't even know what word I'm searching for, to be honest with you, but the way you're talking about learning from is what's so key here. And I think it's really helpful to hear about, it's not about celebrating per se, it's about learning from. So what happened so that we can extract these key learnings to then inform how we go forward? Because I think even really effective, not egocentric type people, you can still look at it and say, what can we learn from that person? At the same time, I have learned a hell of a lot from people who I didn't respect the way I believe they were unfit leaders. And it taught me, I don't want to be that way. So let me get really curious about what I need to do differently. So again, I talk a lot about learning, growing, and evolving. But it all starts with that observing that you talked about it early in here, like the curiosity to investigate something. And sometimes it's like we're actually investigating our own reactions to something.
Yeah. No, and I like that you foreground learning, because I think the key to leadership is really that there's no magic formula. that you can, transpose onto your circumstances. I think there are some kind of general practices that have stood the test of time. But beyond that, it's really context dependent. We all find ourselves in slightly different circumstances, in different industries, in different types of organizations, in different, organizational cultures. And we as individuals, of course, as individual leaders, are also unique. The way we communicate, the way we carry ourselves, and to some extent, we can change these things and evolve over time. On the other hand, it's also a little bit about making do with who we are, right? And modeling your leadership on person X blindly, right, without trying to think how does this fit to me as a person and to my context, I think is the wrong way to go about it. I mean, the way I like to think about this is, so I do a lot of long distance running, and there's great science out there on nutrition, on kind of training volume, on cadence. How often should your feet strike the surface every minute, etc. You can really geek out on this stuff. You have a sports background, so you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And you would be foolish if you're a serious runner not to read all this stuff, because you can't come up with all these insights, all these best practices by yourself. You got to use the knowledge that is out there. But at the same time, like, my body as a runner is unique. There's nobody else out there who has my body who reacts the same way as I do to different foods at different stages in the training, etc. So, I have to constantly see, how does this kind of work with me and my context. And one of my favorite running gurus says, running is an experiment of one. And that's kind of how to think about it. You got to be experimenting, use all the knowledge that's out there, but really you are the only subject of this experiment because you're unique.
Yeah, I'm smiling like a crazy person as you're saying all this, because I don't even think you know this about me, is that I talk a lot about this concept that leadership is a sport. And you're right, it's rooted in my background as an athlete and
Yeah.
working in sports. But it's also, and these days, like I do endurance cycling. So as you're talking
There
about
you go.
that, I'm like, yes, exactly. I know exactly what you're saying. So the thing that works exactly for my husband, it's great information, and then I have to put it through the lens of my authentic self, which might sound weird when I'm talking about the physical nature of my body and riding, but it's the same thing, because to your point, my unique composition, my all of that is a lens that I then have to look at, evaluate. It can inform what I do. And there is that element of learning, adapting, adopting, that kind of thing. But the parallel is so there for, to your point, leadership. So we can't look at someone who we're like, oh, I think that person's a great leader, so I am going to do exactly what that person does. Then you're like literally putting on a jacket that wasn't built for your shoulders. It's silliness. So if you can actually look at it and say, gosh, again, could I learn from that? What's authentic to me? When we try to wear a jacket that doesn't fit our shoulders, it becomes performative, which is so transparent and ineffective, even though it's well intended.
That's a great metaphor. Because we can imagine, right? Somebody who feels like, look at me, I look really good. I got this jacket on that I borrowed from person over here, but everybody can see it doesn't quite fit you the way it should.
Yeah. The reality of that is it's not so much me saying that, well, now you look and sound ridiculous because you're being performative. I mean, that is a truth. I think that it can seem that way, but it's also that the point of this journey of leadership, it has a lot to do with what footprints are you leaving on this earth and with people and on this earth. And so again, if you're not doing it in a way that's true to you, it's like messing up that whole chain. So it comes down to like what's truly effective and not. I'm so curious, why is it that we consistently run into people who don't want to learn from history? I mentioned about what we're facing right now in America, in our politics. And there's a lot of parallels that are drawn to really horrible humans in the past, historically, that have had horrible consequences. And it seems like there is a choice to not see those parallels. And it's like ignoring history. And I'm curious, like, what do you have any thoughts about why that dynamic exists?
I mean, one of the few things, let's say, that seems to be consistent in history is that um, people have consistently been shocked and surprised when the world has been turned upside down, when wars have started, when a revolution has begun, etc. Even if, in hindsight, all of the signs were there that this is where we were headed. So the question is, why do people ignore these things, right? And I suspect, and there's some research to support this, that it's a form of self-defense mechanism that
Hmm.
sometimes we may not want to imagine what might happen, right? The future is open, but the road can lead in a few different directions, and it's feels more comfortable to rule out certain turns that are too horrible to consider, right? And I also think we, especially in the last few decades, have this false sense of history as being stable, right? And if we look back in time, there's just a tremendous amount of instability, especially in the last 200 years since the Industrial Revolution. If we look
Yeah.
in terms of politics, in terms of the economic system, both in a lot of localities and internationally. So kind of change, and often very dramatic change, is the norm, not necessarily the exception. And maybe we've forgotten that a little bit these days. And with that said, I don't want to suggest that we should just throw our hands up and accept that horrible things are going to happen. I think groups of people have a tremendous amount of power to shape the outcome of events, and I think part of what is needed is leadership that can mobilize large groups of people to make collective choices, to take collective action that steers us in let's say in a better direction than one we might otherwise be heading in.
Right. And thank you for saying that, because I'm not, to your point, going down a rabbit hole of negativity. The reality is that history, as we look back, history tends to repeat itself just in different ways. And so I think the more that we can elevate these type of conversations and allow people to see that we really do have choice, we really do have opportunity to look at something, learn, grow, talk through it, come up with better solutions to go forward. It is an element almost, I don't mean to sound like cheesy on this, but it's an element of hope. And how can we operate differently?
Yeah,
And, it's not saying, oh, that exact thing is going to happen again, but it's the same thing as, I hear this a lot in business, is like the fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And that's a bit of what I'm calling upon, is for us to look at this and say, like, we have all these examples, let's not do it the same way. People in business also use the analogy of banging your head against the wall. Well, why continue to do it the same way if it's going to have a negative impact? Let's get curious, let's get courageous. I mentioned
yeah,
your courage early on when we started this recording, and so it's more of a call to people to tap into that more, find some, I don't know, inspiration in that for
yeah,
how to operate differently, to create a better path forward, which oftentimes isn't repeating what's been done in the past.
yeah, yeah. No, and I think in some ways, if we imagine humans, there's in some ways a bit of this contradiction or this tension, because I think it's easy to find examples of us, and now I speak of humanity at large across history, of kind of always kind of falling for the same traps, kind of refusing to change our behavior and our beliefs no matter what happens, that we're kind of stubborn and unteachable. But at the same time, I think there's great examples of very rapid positive change among large groups of populations. Take, for example, kids. So if I have kids between the age of 10 and 15, 3 of them. And when I was their age, I made no decisions whatsoever based on the environmental impact that they would have. It just wasn't on my radar at all. And now, one generation later, my kids, and they're not, they're not kind of sustainability advocates in their day-to-day life, but this is a part of how they live their life, on how they make choices around what we as a family consume and where we go and how we travel. There's just an awareness there in their generation that was not around when I was their age. And that's very hopeful. That's kind of amazing how much has changed in such a short amount of time.
Yeah. And it's the way you just described it is again going back to the word of reframing, which I know is a big part of what you talk about, is that's an opportunity, I think, where you choose to reframe that, because someone else may look at that and say, just focus on the climate change that we've had and the negative impact and all of that, and go into the doomsday rabbit hole, where you're choosing to look at it and go, wow, that's actually a sign of hope that more people are aware about how to operate in a more sustainable way, make different choices. And so again, it's a great example of, as we're going forward, we can look at that in the way that we carry ourselves forward in society, with people in business, as people who have ourselves, others in business in our care. It's so important to think of it that way.
Yeah.
And it brings me to something else I want to make sure we talk about before I lose you here today, is the connection, that intersection of technology and leadership. And because what I see a lot of times is a lot of the technology that's been brought forward is actually, it can be really helpful, right? It can also allow people to fall into a little bit of laziness at times, relying on something a bit too much. So I'm curious, like, what's your take on the intersection of technology?
Oh, there's a lot of things we could talk about here. Maybe a few observations I've made around, the questions of leadership, technology, and organizations. One is that, and this is another, let's say, consistency in the human track record, is that we have an almost, comically poor track record of predicting the impact that a given technology is going to have on organizations, on society, etc. We are not very good at that. Take, I don't even know where to start. In the 1950s, the U.S. Senate assumed that, given the advances in atomic energy and other kind of productivity boosting technologies, the work week by the beginning of the 20th century could be reduced by half. That obviously didn't happen. In the 1930s, when airplanes, were kind of introduced, commercial airplanes, et cetera, the assumption was that within 10 to 20 years, every family is going to have an airplane parked in their front yard, that this will be the mode of travel. And in both of these cases, it's not that the technology failed to live up to what people imagined, right? Airplanes could have been made cheaply enough and available enough that every family could have had one. And atomic energy did kind of dramatically increase the available energy in societies. So there, kind of the technological capabilities and limitations don't play as much of a role as the choices we make around them. And in terms of, let's say, the productivity gains from new energy sources, but also from personal computers and all of this, we haven't used the gains, the productivity gains, to give ourselves more leisure time. Instead, the expectations of the work that we are supposed to do in a given workday have steadily increased. Right? And that's not driven by the technology itself. That's driven by choices that we have made, sometimes as individuals and sometimes as larger groups.
It's such a great point. When you said it, I had this aha moment about the way AI is actually like condensing time for so many people. It
Yeah.
actually, so to your point, it's not freeing up so that I can then go enjoy life or do those type of things for the majority or large numbers of folks, I will say.
Yep.
It's more about how can I condense time to be able to do more, and then it's just that more, where again it's I keep coming back to this idea of reframing, because in my mind, when you reframe something, you give yourself freedom to choose, again, what do you want to learn? What have you learned? What can you apply? How can you operate in a bit of a different way? So again, just I really appreciate the way you described that. So as we're wrapping up here, we've talked about so many things that I think are really important for the audience, for me, to be able to take forward. And I always like to ask every guest, like, what do you hope that people take from your episode?
That's a great question. I mean, I've enjoyed the conversation a lot as well, and that's one of the reasons I enjoy having these talks, whether they're recorded for podcast or more informally. It's because it helps me move my thinking along or kind of test my thinking as well. So it's always a two-way street. And I suppose that's what I hope for your listeners as well, that they don't just consume this episode or your podcast in general, but while they can't engage directly in this conversation that we're having now, kind of do that work on themselves and see, how does this resonate with me and with my context, and does this make sense for me, does this not, etc.
Which goes back to the whole thing of how do you take it and investigate, is this authentic to me? What can I learn, grow and evolve my, the way I'm operating? And so thank you so much again for spending this time with us, for all that you shared. And I paused for a second there because I meant to tell you, as I grew up, my father was very much into history, and he was always giving me these lessons. And so I just wanted to mention that to you, that I think it kind of feeds a little bit of that for me. So I thank you so much for continuing to bring it forward and helping us all to be able to learn from what's happened in the past to help to inform the way we go forward. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'll put links in. Please check out Martin. Please continue to learn from Martin and all that he's doing. So with that, I will say, everyone, have an awesome day.
Thank you so much, Shauna, and thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you.